From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kailey Leinz. The October jobs report tops all estimates. Technically, it was the numbers looking back on September with an unexpected decline in the unemployment rate, leading to a repricing of rate cut expectations. We'll get live reaction from the White House with Jared Bernstein of the Council of Economic Advisors. Plus, we'll have more on the political implications of the data with our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, as Kamala Harris campaigns in Michigan and Donald Trump surveys storm damage in Georgia before a visit to North Carolina. And Israel carries out bombing raids on Hezbollah targets near Beirut, with President Biden discouraging an attack on Iran's oil fields. Jennifer Kavanaugh of Defense Priorities will have more this hour. But we begin on this Friday evening with the blowout jobs report. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su had this to say about it on Bloomberg earlier today.
This jobs report, as great as it is not a declaration of victory. It's a declaration of progress. We're making significant progress, and we need to keep up that trend. We need to keep up that work. Manufacturing jobs have grown, but they're going to grow more as we keep investing in America.
Joining me now for more from the White House North Lawn is Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Happy Friday and Jobs Day to you. 254,000 on non-farm payrolls. Should we be expecting to see a figure like that next month?
Well, before I get to the job numbers, let me just stress that our hearts and our actions here at the White House are also with those whose lives and whose communities were devastated by Hurricane Helene. The president and the vice president are going to continue to deploy all the necessary resources to help those affected by this terrible event. Turning to the great jobs report, look, any month can bip or bop one way or the other. The thing we like to do to make sure that we smooth out these ups and downs is to take a 3-month average of the underlying pace of job growth. If you do that, you get payrolls at 186,000 per month for the past 3 months. That is a healthy rate of job growth. It is certainly strong enough to push the unemployment rate down. It's close to anybody's kind of upper bound of what you might think of as a break-even rate, the rate of payroll jobs you need to keep the unemployment rate where it is, and very much a full employment kind of condition in the job market.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right to note the humanitarian, potentially economic disaster this country has experienced in the Southeast thanks to Hurricane Helene. Before we continue our focus on the labor market, do you have an expectation of what the economic toll ultimately of the storm will be when all is tallied? Well,
first of all, thanks for acknowledging the importance of that on a day when we're touting strong economic data. You know, I could think about the economic toll, and there's always a difference, by the way, in the national accounts between net and gross activity. So sometimes you'll see economic activity bounce back strongly because of rebuilding efforts. But I really want to focus on the humanitarian challenges that have been so deep. And, you know, I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the extent to which this White House is laser focused on making sure those folks have all the resources they need. We're not done with this when it fades from the front pages by a long shot. We're going to keep, as I said, deploying necessary resources until folks there are well back on their feet.
Well, of course, we saw the president surveying the damage in a number of affected states over the last few days. But earlier today, sir, we saw the president in the briefing room. Something we haven't seen to this point in his presidency, where he had to field a question about an allegation from Senator Marco Rubio about today's job numbers being fake. This was his response, and then I'll have you respond as well.
If you notice, anything the MAGA Republicans don't like, they call fake. Anything. The job numbers are what the job numbers are. They're real. They're sincere. They're what we are. And by the way, just look at how the EU talks about us, how they like to have an economy like ours. Just talk about the rest of the world looks at us and what we're doing. So well, I don't want to get going.
Mr. Chairman, how would you explain what's happening in the data to those that question its validity?
Well, first of all, let me say that I saw the same clip. I happened to be watching that streaming as the president made those comments, and I quickly shot him off an email saying I thought he fielded that question perfectly. I thought he was spot on. You never hear those folks complain when there's a downside surprise, only when there's an upside surprise, and that shows you how disingenuous they're being. Obviously, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has impeccable integrity when it comes to these numbers, and to try to politicize them with such an obvious false message is, pretty reprehensible. What was your question?
Well, just how we should be thinking about the kind of vacillations we are seeing in the labor market, and how we saw upward revisions this time. We saw downward revisions previously, an 800,000 plus downward revision to the original BLS estimates when looking back over the period.
Yeah, I don't remember any of those folks calling that fake news. Yeah, they didn't.
All right,
so
well,
again, it's ridiculous. So, but your question is a much better one, which is how should we think about the ups and downs? Well, one of the things you do is you smooth things out by taking longer-term averages, as I did earlier in our conversation. And then, of course, you recognize that as new data comes in, you're going to get revisions. And that revision doesn't mean there was anything untoward. It just means that when you get new information, you incorporate it and you use it. By the way, we had very strong GDP revisions, and many people expected that was going to go the other way. One of the things I noted there, and it does connect to the jobs report, is that real disposable income per capita, you take out the transfers so you can have a smooth path there again, that's up $4,000 real since this president took office. We learned this morning that wages grew 4% nominal over the past year. Last seen CPI was 2.5%. That was August. In September, expectation is for a CPI around that number. I saw 2.3 this morning. That means something like 1.5, 1.7 in terms of real wage gains over the past year. That's what's feeding into those strong disposable income numbers. So real buying power pushing ahead for American workers, families, and consumers.
Well, and of course, consumers have needed that extra buying power as they've been dealing with higher inflation. We know that has been coming down, and yet there were a number of factors we were looking at this week about that could potentially be inflationary. A super resilient labor market could be one of those. We have higher oil prices off of what's happening in the Middle East. We thought we may get higher goods prices after the Dockworkers strike. That seems to be resolved for now. But when you look at these things in aggregate, Mr. Chairman, are you worried that inflationary pressures could reignite?
I think when it comes to inflation, the trend is our friend. The PCE, I believe, last seen was 2.2% year over year. And of course, that's the gauge that the Fed watches most closely. The national gas price this morning was $3.18 a gallon. That's 60 cents below where it was a year ago. But of course, you're right to bring in the pressures on the oil price, and that's very much a function of geopolitical pressures that we're watching very closely. Look, I think the supply chain point you made is really important, so let's not blow by that. One of the main reasons inflation has come down as far as it has, one of the main reasons why we have a round trip on year-over-year inflation, or almost a round trip back to target, is because of the unsnarling of supply chains. There was a risk that the labor action could have exacerbated that. Both sides negotiated. We were certainly trying to be helpful in that regard. Business came out ahead. Workers came out ahead. That's collective bargaining in action, and we thought it was a great result.
All right, Mr. Chairman, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. That's Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Enjoy the weekend. Coming up, we'll have more on how today's jobs numbers could impact the Fed's next move. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This jobs number today and the whole report is a superb report. As a central bank, you don't want to react too much to 1 month's report. If we get more reports like this, as I say, I think we should have more confidence that we are in fact settling in at the landing spot that we want from a dual mandate perspective.
Austin Goolsbee, Chicago Fed president, earlier today on Bloomberg talking about the jobs numbers that were much higher than expected and the impact it could have on the Fed's next rate decision. For more, I'm joined now by Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe here in our Washington, D.C. studio. So obviously we just got a 50 basis point cut that Chairman Powell explained was largely because they wanted to keep the labor market from deteriorating in a material way. They wanted to sustain what we're seeing. If the labor market might be reheating, and I'm not sure that's the correct way to read these numbers, does that mean the Fed might have some regrets?
I don't think so. I think what you heard Chair Powell saying at his last press conference, and since we've heard from him since the meeting, is that was sort of an insurance policy, right? The labor market is in a good place. It has cooled down, and they don't want to see it cool any further than here. So I don't think there would be any regrets about that. I think today's report definitely makes it seem like the need for another 50 is not really high, and it kind of tips the scale in favor of a quarter-point cut at the next meeting. I think it gives people confidence that the Fed is not behind the curve and that the labor market isn't falling off a cliff. Yeah.
Well, but when we look at the different pockets of the labor market, if you zero in, for example, on manufacturing, where there's been 34,000 job losses over the last 2 months, according to the data, is that the kind of thing that the Fed might be latching onto that is still giving them cause for concern?
Well, I think you see that. You see that the job gains have been very narrow, right? It's a few industries that are creating the jobs that we are creating. We've seen the unemployment rate come up, although it fell in this report. It's up from earlier in the year. We've seen the pace of job creation slow. So although Fed officials feel like the labor market is still in a solid place, we have seen a cool down, and they don't want to see it cool down anymore because once it does start to weaken, then it can be a problem.
Well, speaking of things that could have been problems, the Dockworkers strike that began and then ultimately ended this week was one of them. Of course, they did reach an agreement on wages. And earlier this morning, Lael Brainerd, the director of the National Economic Council, had this to say about that temporary suspension of the work stoppage. Take a listen.
In terms of the progress at the bargaining table, for many months, the two parties hadn't been working together. Now they have extended the contract in order to really roll up their sleeves and address the remaining issues on the table, having now solved the wage piece of this.
So the strike lasted for 3 days. We'll deal with this again in January of next year, possibly. But did those 3 days cause anything that's going to be a material impact on the economy that will have to weigh into monetary policy?
I don't think so. I don't think people are expecting that to show up in the jobs report for this month. But we do have other workers who are striking, the Boeing workers.
Sure.
We did have the hurricane, as you all were just discussing in the last segment. So those sorts of things could actually make the next jobs report a little hard to interpret, a little muddy. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And we get that right before the next meeting.
Yep, and right before the election as well. And we're also going to get some inflation data next week. Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, one of the factors we're looking at when it comes to the inflation picture is oil, which had its biggest move upward on a weekly basis since October of 2022 this week as we watch what's happening in the Middle East. Earlier today, President Biden joined the White House press briefing, as we mentioned earlier, and had this to say when asked about the possibility of Israel targeting Iran's oil fields.
The Israelis have not concluded what they're going to do in terms of a strike. That's under discussion. I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be thinking about other alternatives than striking oil fields.
For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Iain Marlow, who covers foreign policy for us. So, Iain, obviously, we're still awaiting some kind of retaliation that is expected for Israel, or at least a response to the strikes against Israel, Iran's missile barrage from earlier this week. Is it likely to be an attack on oil infrastructure and energy, or does that risk escalating to too great a degree?
I think we've seen over the past year that Israel is not afraid of defying the United States when it comes to Biden telling Netanyahu what to do when it comes to their security interests. They were suggesting not to go against Hezbollah. They told them to get a ceasefire in Gaza. There's a lot of stuff that they've been trying to get the Israelis to do. And when it comes to Israeli security, and their own view on what they need to do, they tend to do it. I think there's a sense that Iran and Israel have been hitting each other's military targets, or aiming at them at least, as opposed to civilian targets. And I think that's the impression with the oil facilities, that this would be a non-military target, and that would be somewhat escalatory and might have some response from Iran coming back. And I think you've heard the advice publicly. I think the U.S. is telling the Israelis that privately, and I think the Americans want the Israelis to do something back to Iran. They know they have to do something, but they want them to do something that doesn't make Iran respond in kind and then set off another spiral of different tit-for-tat retaliations.
Well, Iain, of course, you're the co-author of our Big Take piece today that looks at this leverage question when it comes to the U.S. and what seems to be an inability to get Israel to necessarily do what the U.S. wishes it would. You can find it, of course, on the terminal and online. But the U.S. has exercised some leverage, if you will. They've withheld, for example, some large bombs over concern about how they could be used in Gaza and the civilian casualties that could result. Are we likely to see that again if the U.S. thinks that Israel is about to do something too escalatory in nature, say Iran's nuclear sites, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to know right now. I think looking back at that decision the Biden administration did, they only did it once. They only did it with one shipment of weapons, and it was those 2,000-pound bombs. It was specifically about the campaign the Israelis wanted to do against Rafah in southern Gaza. And there was a lot of backlash to that decision when it was the only time they withheld weapons. The Israelis got mad at them. Republicans got mad at them. Progressive Democrats got mad at them for not going even further and banning all weapons. And so it's a situation where the Biden administration, to some degree, is in a lose-lose situation. Israel is ignoring a lot of its pleas and doing what they want. The only upside, really, right now is that Israel is making gains against Iran. They're degrading Hezbollah. Hamas is degraded. They don't have a ceasefire. They don't have the hostages out. There's a lot of instability. There's, the threat of a looming war between Israel and Iran that might pull in the U.S., but some of that is theoretical at the moment, and I think the U.S. Is somewhat happy behind the scenes with the progress that Israel is making with Hezbollah in Lebanon. As bad as it looks and as destabilizing as it is, Israel and the U.S. share a few fundamental strategic goals in the Middle East, and Iran is the big rival there, and so for both of them. So I think the U.S. hasn't given us much pushback to this Lebanon campaign as we saw with parts of the Gaza campaign, and I think that's been because the U.S. is not displeased with how it's going so far.
Well, Iran might be. Though, as its most powerful proxy is getting degraded by Israel. So it raises the question of if this is a lose-lose situation for Iran. It's a loss if you look weak, but it's also a loss if you don't want to be involved in a wider war with the U.S. When you don't have as many allies to call upon as maybe Israel does. Is that why we're seeing Iran signaling openness to a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah and Israel? Yeah,
that was a really interesting development this week that I didn't necessarily see coming. It's strange because at the moment a ceasefire doesn't really seem to be in the cards for either Hamas, which has been ignoring entreaties to try and do a ceasefire for months now. And the U.S. brought out a ceasefire in the middle of last week when everyone was up in New York for the United Nations General Assembly high-level week. And the ceasefire was quickly made sort of old news by the fact that Israel went ahead and killed Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and then did a ground invasion of Lebanon. And so those ceasefires at the moment are not really in the cards to some degree. But one of my colleagues this week did have a good story out on the terminal saying that the failure of Iran's conventional strike with those ballistic missiles earlier this week and just the situation they're in with Hezbollah being degraded may actually force them to consider, going across that nuclear weapons threshold and sort of reviving some of those efforts that have concerned the U.S. and others, obviously.
All right, Bloomberg's Iain Marlow, thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll turn back to today's better-than-expected jobs report, which comes as immigration continues to be an economic and political issue. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. On the heels of today's jobs report, we're taking a closer look at how immigration is impacting the labor market. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has more from the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kailey. As both candidates start to outline their immigration plans, economists say that there could be impacts on the U.S. labor market. When we look at the data, it shows that a recent influx in immigration has helped boost the U.S. labor supply. You had the chance to talk to economist and Bloomberg opinion contributor Catherine Edwards about this earlier on Balance of Power.
The economy is growing, which means the need for a workforce is growing. And if we have not produced enough Americans or have high enough labor force participation among Americans, then we always as a country have looked to immigration to fill that hole.
And additions to the country's labor force are needed. A new study says U.S. employers will face a 6 million worker shortage within a decade. That's according to Lightcast, a provider of labor market data, which finds the U.S. is increasingly adding more consumers than producers. The study projects immigrants will be essential for key industries where foreign-born workers already make up a considerable share of positions, including construction and hospitality and leisure. An estimated 3.8 million immigrated to the U.S. in fiscal year 2024, substantially increasing the number of available workers. For context, net immigration averaged below 1 million in the 2010s. A Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco paper out this summer suggests this rise was largely fueled by undocumented immigrants and that the surge helped contribute to a loosening in the U.S. labor market. Now, I had the chance to speak with Senate Banking Committee member Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, last week, and I asked him about this intersection between the labor market and immigration as it becomes a political issue.
We need to have more legal choices for guest worker programs, those sorts of things, and then have bigger consequences for people who try to come here illegally. I think that that's an argument that at the end of the day will win in a Trump administration. Trump Enterprises uses a number of guest workers in their own operations. They get the need for it, and it's not at the expense of American jobs. In fact, in many cases, if you do it right, having those positions here create additional American jobs.
Now, Kailey, for her part, Vice President Kamala Harris visited the border last week, and while she was outlining her path for a legal pathway to citizenship, she said that she would highlight workers that are already contributing to the U.S. economy, specifically calling out immigrants who work in the agricultural sector. Kailey.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall at the White House this evening. Thank you. Now, coming up, this Monday marks 1 year since the events of October 7th, and as tensions escalate in the region leading up to this anniversary, we'll be joined by Jennifer Kavanaugh of Defense Priorities. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The main thing we can do is try to rally the rest of the world, our allies, into participating like the French are in Lebanon and other places to tamp this down. But when you have proxies as irrational as Hezbollah and the Houthis, and it's a hard thing to determine.
That was President Biden in the White House briefing room earlier today when asked what can be done to prevent a wider war in the Middle East. This, of course, as we see tensions escalating between Israel and Hezbollah, as well as Iran directly. Joining me now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Jennifer Kavanaugh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Jennifer, welcome back to Balance of Power. We are still awaiting, obviously, Israel's response to the barrage of missiles Iran sent its way earlier this week. What form do you expect that response will take? What will Israel try to hit?
I think it's still undecided right now. A number of targets have been proposed or floated, both in the media and by various political actors, ranging from a focus on a more proportional response that would focus on Iranian military targets to hitting parts of Iran's civilian infrastructure, like its oil facilities, or in the extreme case, targeting Iran's nuclear program. Biden has indicated that he's urged Netanyahu to rule out the more extreme options and to look for proportional responses towards the lower end, military targets, for example.
Well, as we consider the idea that maybe they will not go for proportionate, could, for example, strike oil infrastructure, this is something I spoke about on the early edition of Balance of Power with Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And this is what he said today about what Iran could do in return if Israel does indeed target the oil economy.
I think there is a decided chance that Israel will attack Iran's oil economy and that Iran will respond not by attacking Israel again, which it's proven itself relatively incapable of doing, at least with this missile approach, but instead by trying to hurt the whole world economy and hurt the United States in the process. To throw the world economy into a tizzy a few weeks before a U.S. election, you have to think through the effects on American politics if you're in Iran's shoes.
Jennifer, I have two questions for you related to that response. The first being, do you think Iran could close the Strait of Hormuz as a result of what happens next?
I think that would be quite difficult. People often propose that that's something that Iran might do. But in reality, the blockades and those types of activities are quite difficult and militarily challenging, especially when you have so much U.S. naval power in the region. We've seen with the Houthi strikes in the Red Sea that U.S. military response has been pretty ineffective, but it's also been very restrained in terms of what the U.S. military is willing to do. I think an attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz might be met with additional force, especially if it were Iranian forces that were trying to shut those waters. So it's certainly possible they would try. I'm not sure, though, how successful they would be. And the final point I think to keep in mind is that we've seen in the Red Sea how quickly commerce adjusts to find new commercial routes. So certainly it would have an effect on shipping prices, but it's something that the economy could probably absorb pretty quickly.
Well, it is, of course, the price impact that could be felt most directly here at home in the midst of a presidential election that is just over 4.5 weeks away, maybe less than that now, Jennifer. And that kind of brings me to the second point of Michael's remarks there, this notion that Iran will have to consider American politics and its decision making here, knowing, and I was just speaking with the Deputy Attorney General about this last week, Iran has been engaging in misinformation and disinformation campaigns, even hacking into the Trump campaign's infrastructure in order to share information with what was then the Biden campaign. It does appear that Iran does not want Donald Trump to win this election. So if we assume that is true, how does that inform the regime's thinking here?
Well, if it's the case that Iran doesn't want Donald Trump to win, then throwing the economy into chaos doesn't really support that strategy. In fact, they would probably prefer that oil prices would stay stable if their goal is, in fact, to prevent Trump from winning. An alternative is that their goal is not directionally focused, but rather just to sow chaos in the U.S. election process, in which case a price spike might be helpful to them. So I think it could go either way. It's also important to remember that all actors in the region right now have the U.S. election in their mind. So it's not just Iran that's thinking about the U.S. election as they respond, but also Netanyahu, Hamas, Hezbollah. Everyone knows that that's a looming date that's coming up that affects both how the U.S. will respond between now and November and sort of the time horizon for policy changes on the U.S. side.
Well, that's an excellent point, Jennifer. And if we assume that Netanyahu is thinking about a change in administration that will be upon us come January, does that mean there is very little incentive to consider the U.S. desires as to how Israel moves forward militarily from here?
I would say yes. I don't think that Netanyahu has shown all that much regard for U.S. preferences to this point. That could be a function of the coming election and his sense that Biden is essentially a lame duck and that it doesn't matter. Also, potentially him holding out and hoping that Trump would come into office. Trump's first presidency was very favorable for Israel, and Netanyahu may be hoping that that is a benefit to him in the future. So I think that that's certainly something that that he's thinking about in terms of his openness to a ceasefire. At the same time, I'm not sure how much he's thinking about U.S. preferences and interests at all right now. I think he's really focused on domestic politics. And he knows that generally the U.S. political dynamics are such that no politician at any point is willing to separate themselves too far from Israel, sort of regardless of how Israel moves forward in its regional conflicts.
Well, and of course, Israel maintains its goal here is to be able to return Israelis to the north of the country, which is why they are conducting these operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Hezbollah, though we understand, is the best armed, perhaps most potent enemy for Israel in terms of the Iranian proxies. And if this is a campaign degrading their ability to continue to threaten Israel's north, do we have a sense realistically of how much longer it will take for Israel to feel that the north can be secure, how much longer we might see bombing in and around Beirut?
Well, honestly, I think it's going to be a while. The early indications was that this was going to be a short, limited incursion, but it already seems to have expanded substantially. Israel has asked residents in southern Lebanon, well above the Litani River, to move further north. In order for Israel to expand that buffer zone, it's going to take time for their forces to be able to move through all that territory. I think that the operation is going to be challenging. We've seen that in past Israeli activity in Lebanon, that it's never been as easy as expected. And then there's the question of what happens after they've, secured this buffer zone. They have to stay there to keep it secure. So I think that the reality is that this is going to be a long-term thing, regardless of what the early indications were when this started.
Yeah, and the day after question raised again in Lebanon, just as we've had it when it comes to Gaza. Jennifer Kavanaugh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Thank you. Coming up, we'll turn back to domestic politics and how today's jobs report might impact the election. Our signature political panel joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I thought he fielded that question perfectly. I thought he was spot on. You never hear those folks complain when there's a downside surprise, only when there's an upside surprise, and that shows you how disingenuous they're being. Obviously, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has impeccable integrity when it comes to these numbers, and to try to politicize them with such an obvious false message is, pretty reprehensible.
Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, earlier this hour on Balance of Power, reflecting on this month's blowout jobs numbers and his response to those who claimed it was fake. Joining me now for more, our closers and signature political panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, I want to come to you just on this fake notion first, because it was Senator Marco Rubio who touted these figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics as being fake, if the White House is to be believed, because they were good. Are they so good that it really is dangerous to Republicans who have been trying to run on the issue of the economy and are looking like they maybe have less potent arguments against Democrats on that issue?
Yeah, it's just a classic attack the attacker, right? Normally this would be an individual who was making a statement, and you don't have anybody to point to attack their credibility. They're not expert. And so they attack the institutions that generate the numbers, which, of course, has become the standard attack in politics now, is attacking institutions of which you're a part of, right? I mean, Senator Rubio is part of government that produces these numbers that we all make decisions by. So which numbers is he going to use to make decisions?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure you have the answer to that, or me, or Jeannie. I don't know if you have one. But, of course, this comes when we've all had a conversation today about whether this report, and frankly just the last 24 hours, inclusive of an agreement of the dockworkers to postpone their strike until January, add up to more momentum for Kamala Harris when it comes to the economy.
It does. You know, she had some bad news earlier this week with this strike at the port in particular, and of course what's going on in the Middle East, not to mention the storm. But the fact that the administration was able to work with the labor in this case and help get this resolved at least until January is definitely a sigh of relief coming from the Kamala Harris's campaign. And then you look at this jobs report. I mean, it doesn't get much better than the jobs report today, which is why, of course, you've got Senator Rubio and others coming out and saying that it's fake. The reality is Republicans know what we all know by looking at the polls. That had been Donald Trump's winning case, the economy. When Joe Biden was at the top of this ticket, in some polls, he was winning on the economy and inflation by double-digit numbers. But as Kamala Harris has taken the reins, those numbers have diminished substantially. And, of course, the latest poll out of American University shows that with women, they see Kamala Harris in a much better light than Donald Trump when it comes to handling the economy, inflation, cost of living. That's a problem for the Donald Trump campaign. It's a problem for Republicans down ballot, and they're expressing their frustration in the form of calling it fake numbers.
Well, Jeannie, I'm glad you mentioned the American University poll, because you're right. 46% of women they surveyed prefer Harris over Trump to handle the economy. Just 38% prefer Trump on it. And there are even more strong figures in Harris's favor when it comes to handling the issue of inflation. So as we get ready to see her in a few moments here campaigning in Flint, Michigan, Rick, and what she is dubbing an economic speech, does that mean her messaging is resonating, or just that she's not Joe Biden and so people don't necessarily feel like the weight of Joe Biden's economy of the last 3.5 years is attached to her?
I think a little bit of both. So she has done a good job of pivoting away from the administration and being the change candidate. Extremely hard to do if you're a member of the administration like she is. But two, remember, she's making progress with women. She has a huge gender gap with men. And so we always talk about the women gender gap that exists between Republicans and Democrats in general, but a very large one between Harris and Trump. But she has almost the same level of gap between her support amongst white men and Donald Trump's. So she can't be losing white men by 25 points and winning white women by 26 points and think that's a fair trade. Now, women vote at a higher rate than men. So, I mean, you get into all this kind of leverage when it comes to that. But you'll notice lately the messaging out of the Harris campaign has been focused on men, and they're trying to close that gap up. They need to get that gap, based on pollsters that I've talked to, down to about a 15% gap. It's okay to lose men, but you can't lose them by more than 15%.
So, Jeannie, how does she do that realistically? What's the issue that wins her more male votes?
You know, it's going to be tough. I agree with Rick. She needs to get that gap down, just like Donald Trump is trying to close the gap a little bit with women. It's hard to do. You know, that's why the campaign was touting this endorsement by Bruce Springsteen, for instance, hoping he
we'll get to that.
Hoping he can gin up some enthusiasm with this blue collar, particularly white, non-college educated males. But very tough for her to do. I think the reality is she's got to focus on the economy, number one, and the loss of the firefighters' endorsement. That's a challenge for her, because that's exactly the group, the demographic she needs to win. So she's got to focus, as she has been, on the economy. What happened on September 18th, the Fed reducing the interest rates. She's got to be talking about that, because the macroeconomic numbers from September 18th to today with the jobs report look very strong for her. And also the fact that Donald Trump can't stick to an economic message. Those things will help her, but she's got to talk about it like she is today in Michigan.
Okay, well, if she's going to be focusing on the date of September 18th, Donald Trump tomorrow is going to be focusing on July 13th, the first attempt on his life in Butler, Pennsylvania. He'll be returning there tomorrow with Elon Musk in tow. Rick, it's one thing to mark the attempted assassination and doing so 1 month out from the election, but to bring Elon Musk, how does that work in his favor?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a distraction. I mean, Elon Musk is a incredibly popular guy. He's got, tens of millions of people that follow him on X. He's renowned in his, capability to make money and create inventions that change the world.
Sure.
So he's not just anybody. And I do think he brings a cachet to Trump in that he has legitimately built businesses and created industries that heretofore weren't around before he did that. And so he adds this panache that Trump has kind of lost, which was the businessman Donald Trump, which is how he got elected in 2016. But like to distract from the message that I stood up against an assassin's bullet and prevailed, fight, 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 with Elon Musk dancing around in the background, I think it's a missed opportunity to really drive home a message that Donald Trump's a survivor.
Jeannie, I wonder if you agree with that, but I also want to talk to you about the boss. So we're going to leave that here for now and come back to Rick and Jeannie, have more on these celebrity endorsements next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are committed to a vision of this country that respects and includes everyone, regardless of class, religion, race, your political point of view, or sexual identity. And they want to grow our economy in a way that benefits all, not just a few like me on top.
That was Bruce Springsteen giving Kamala Harris and Tim Walz his endorsement. There's definitely a born to run pun somewhere in here. Back with us now, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino. So, Jeannie, she got the boss on side. Also, Taylor Swift, Chaperone. I mean, we could talk about a number of figures in entertainment and Hollywood. How much do they matter realistically? Is anyone who wasn't already going to vote for Harris going to be swayed by the endorsement of Bruce Springsteen?
You know, by the way, I thought we were going to get some Bruce music on the intro there, Kailey, but we did not. And, you know, I think there's nothing lost. I'm not a huge fan of celebrity endorsements. The research shows that, by and large, they don't really translate into votes, but they do translate to a certain extent into enthusiasm. And, of course, as we were just talking about, Kamala Harris needs that enthusiasm with a huge portion of Bruce Springsteen diehard fans, you know, men, blue collar, the people that he appeals to. And so from that perspective, listen, you can't go wrong with the boss. So whether it turns out or not, maybe it'll at least allow her to use Born to Run in her at her rallies. I don't know.
Well, there you go. As Jeannie talks about it translating into enthusiasm, what about translating into money? Is that actually what a lot of these celebrities are best used for?
Sure. George Clooney, sure. An avid fundraiser for President Biden and now Harris. So, yeah, they can turn into great bundlers. People want to be in the room with them and will pay money to do that. But I think it is a momentum game. I mean, you know, right now the table is set. We're not going to have anything happen between now and Election Day that's extraordinary. No more debates, you know, hopefully no international incidents outside of like what we already have on the table. And so how do you maintain or create a momentum for your campaign, for your own voters to be excited about your campaign? And so I do think these things can you know, take you, but they do distract from the message. Like today, the message should be the economy. As Jeannie was saying earlier, you got great economic news. This is all we should be talking about. And so instead, we've got a share of the news cycle being Bruce Springsteen. Not a bad thing, but not on message.
Well, I wonder if the best way for the Harris campaign to combine a celebrity kind of aspect and message is Barack Obama. Jeannie, the most popular, probably one of them, figures in Democratic politics, going to be hitting the trail for Harris in the final month leading up to the campaign. Is that actually the best endorsement and surrogate that she has to utilize?
Really important. You know, he's raised over almost $80 million so far. He's hitting the trail. He's making these key endorsements, and he has proven to be able to get Democrats out to vote, and that's what they need to do. So that is important. And I also just want to point to the fact, did Rick just say no more October surprises? I hope he is right. But boy, that's a big, big prediction on Rick Davis's part.
Yeah, it's only October 4th, Rick. You sure you want to stick to that call?
I'm leaning in. Like I'm exhausted. I want this campaign to end.
Well, that's all of it. All right, we got a minute left here. Favorite Bruce song, Rick Davis?
You know, they're all fantastic for me.
Too many to pick from.
Which means I don't actually know too many Bruce Springsteen songs.
All right, Jeannie, what about you?
It's Born to Run, Kailey, and you have to tell me what your mother's is, because I hear she's a big fan.
Oh, I don't think that would be like picking her favorite child, which probably is me. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, thank you both so much for joining me as we round out the week here in Washington. Appreciate it. Of course, you can get more coverage in the Washington edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And we'll be back on Monday for full coverage of what we're going to see in the campaign over this weekend. Again, as we discussed, Donald Trump going to be in Butler, Pennsylvania, alongside Elon Musk. Kamala Harris will be traveling to North Carolina to survey the damage from Hurricane Helene. And as always, we'll have it all covered for you here on Balance of Power. So have a great evening and a great weekend. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.